The 90s were finally starting to come into their own, discarding the remnants of the 80s and embracing the future. Well, not everywhere. Romania was in its fourth minor raid of the 90s. A minor raid is a term that only exists in Romania, though this one was somewhat less bloody than the one used to outright murder people that didn't want more communists to take over the country just a year ago. This was when Yugoslavia broke apart, when the Soviet Union broke apart, when Terminator 2 premiered, when 200,000 people were killed by a cyclone in Bangladesh, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were unveiled, when Linus Torvald released the first version of the most popular operating system in the world, Linux, when Silicon and Synapse was founded and would soon become Blizzard, when the internet was opened for unrestricted commercial use, reaching 1 million connected computers for the first time, and Tim Berners-Lee released the world's first web browser. What a time to be alive. Well, you know, if you could. But moving on to video games. 1991 was a year of many firsts, many greats, and many amazing titles. One of my favorite racing games ever made, Jeff Crammond's F1 Grand Prix, made its way to computers throughout the world. Created in Microprose's MPS Labs, this was what could be called the first proper racing simulator. There were quite a few before it. Indianapolis 500, the simulation by Papyrus, was a great stepping stone, but this took it to a whole new level. A game that aimed to simulate everything that could be simulated with the hardware of 1991, from aerodynamics to engine mechanics to tire wear to pretty much everything there was. And it went beyond by including replay options, the ability to skip through time, and the option to play with other people in so many ways that it basically built the online racing community. Not for itself, or not only for itself, but in general. You could even play a racing game by mail, and I'm not talking about email. It not only set a standard of quality that endures to this day, but even though it looks like it does and runs at a steady 25.6 frames a second, people were still organizing competitions with it even 20 years later. Fans of games found randomly on school computers that happened to be about cavemen and dinosaurs rejoiced this year with the release of both Join Mac by Data East and Prehistoric by Titus France. I mention these games because I have inadvertently played them quite a lot. Many of the people I know have played them quite a lot. They were everywhere for some strange reason. If dinosaur games were not your thing, then odds are you had found Superplex on some computer, a clone of Boulder Dash that was made by Philip Jesperson and Michael Stopp. It was a game that put you in control of Murphy, an entity that we sort of agreed on was a virus, going around the computer eating everything it could, avoiding obstacles and solving some mad physics and navigation puzzles. And if that still was not your jam, then Chris Perry's Ski Free was certainly a game that you played more than you realized you ever could. An enduring classic and refuge of the board that always ended with tragedy, burning bushes, and a satisfied abominable snowman. Fans of hedgehogs and going fast, however, would feast their eyes on something different, on what some call the Sega Genesis's crowning jewel, at least in terms of mascot power, this being Sega's new face. Goodbye Alex Kidd, hello Sonic the Hedgehog, a game that was to platformers what a drag race is to driving to work. It was a technical splendor that showcased the power of the console, its speed, and its in-your-face attitude, leading to the extreme trend of the 90s. On the opposing side of the console war, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, a major improvement on the concept of the previous game in the series, especially the first one, adding numerous new tools and reasons to adventure forth in an attempt to save a world torn in two. It was noted at the time for the way in which it used a parallel world system with alternate versions of the same location, each with its own particularities and requiring the use of both of them to solve puzzles. DMA Design brought us a quirky puzzle game about pushing funny little creatures steps to their doom in order to solve a problem, with Lemmings, a monster of a game that sold in one form or another over 20 million units, a stepping stone in the company's road to greatness that would eventually end with, well, it didn't actually end, only now the studio is called Rockstar, and we're all awaiting the release of Red Dead Redemption 2 that will probably sell at least 100 million units. The once lovable Duke Nukem also made his appearance at this time in a game that was mainly a ripoff of Turrican, going as far as to share some of the same graphical elements, though it was a far cry from the Duke Nukem we know now, both in terms of the character and the game he was in, this not being a first-person shooter with interactivity with its world, but instead a platformer with shooting elements in it. This was also the year when we got the MMO genre. Though it technically existed in the form of mods for decades, this was when it began to crystallize in the form of Neverwinter Nights. It was made by Stormford Studios and Dan Daglow, the same Dan Daglow that made Dungeons, the first adaptation of the D&D rule system around 15 years earlier, also the same man that made Utopia, the progenitor of the Sim game and the God game. Neverwinter Nights was based on the Gold Box engine, the one behind the many titles that SSI put out since Pool of Radiance, and it had a similar style of play, only it worked through the internet, allowing up to 50 people to live and fight in the same world. This number would eventually be increased to 500 as technology improved, with up to 2,000 of its 115,000 players present at peak hours until it was shut down in 1997, but the name lives on, as well as its legacy. A developer by the name of Eric Chahi continued the work that Jordan Mechner started on defining the cinematic action game by creating Another World, a platformer for the Amiga and the Atari ST that showcased superb graphics for the time and a fantastic sense of immersion, coupled with great visual storytelling. It featured no on-screen text, no interface, and what little dialogue existed was spoken only in an alien language that you could not understand. It was a masterpiece when it came to dropping the player into another world and letting them figure it out on their own or face the consequences. Capcom brought forth this year what many have called its greatest creation, Street Fighter 2. Although it was far from being the first fighting game, it wasn't even the first in the series, it became the definition of what a fighting game should be in terms of characters, abilities, stages, music, style, structure, basically everything. It was and still is the most successful fighting game ever made. What with it having more versions than I can count, keeping arcades alive after the allure of Double Dragon faded, and being resold and re-released on dozens of platforms for decades. Street Fighter 2 is not only still being played, but it is still considered in some of its versions as the best fighting game ever made, due to it basically creating the tournament fighting scene. Esports that were actually entertaining to watch, that were thrilling, gripping, exciting, easy to understand by people with no knowledge of what was happening, were born. This inspired many other companies to try their own hand at the genre, like SNK with its own Fatal Fury King of Fighters, the inception of 2 video game series in one package for the fledgling Neo Geo platform. I'd like to give the game of 1991 title to Street Fighter 2 or to Grand Prix, but I've said I'll try to limit myself to only one game. And it so happens that there was one more release that year that warrants the title a bit more than these two. Sid Meier's Civilization is a game that I've discussed at length on the channel. It is a game that allows you to control a civilization from the Stone Age up until the Space Age, from a tribe to a continent-spanning civilization, from savages to astronauts, from spears to nuclear weapons, going through the ages of progress and interaction with many other civilizations in a world that you affected, that grows with you, that is changed by you, an experience that reshapes the way in which you view the world, and all it asks from you is that you give it one more turn. Civilization managed to distill decades of turn-based strategy games into the 4X we know now and usually have complicated relationships with, that involve love and and also hate, mostly because that's what other members of the family feel towards the games. It is a genre that aims to put you in the role of the immortal leader of a millennia-spanning empire to explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate all that stands before you, so that your civilization, your labor, your grand plans may stand the test of time. And Civilization has sure done that. And so we end 1991. Next year we move on to the genesis of the last few unbirthed genres and some of the greatest creations of the age. Goodbye.